If I were to ask you who has the upper hand in a trade war between the United States and Canada, you wouldn't hesitate. You'd look at the numbers. The US economy is 10 times larger. Canada sends 75% of its exports south, while the US only sends 18% of its exports north. On paper, it looks like a David and Goliath story where Goliath has all the leverage. The narrative in Washington is simple. Canada needs us, but we don't need Canada. But what if I told you that this math is dangerously incomplete? What if I told you that by cutting off Canada, the United States wouldn't just be hurting a neighbor, it would be amputating its own industrial limbs? What if the leverage the US thinks it has is actually a tether that, if snapped, would cause a catastrophic collapse of the American heartland? Most people see Canada as a nice-to-have partner, a source of lumber, oil, and maybe some car parts. But the reality is that Canada is the invisible foundation of the American economy. From the fertilizer that grows the food on your table, to the uranium that powers your cities, and the critical minerals that build your missiles, the US is far more dependent on Canada than it realizes. Welcome to the hidden reality of the North American divorce. This is why cutting off Canada would hurt the US more than it thinks. To understand the vulnerability, we have to start with the food security trap. When Americans think of national security, they think of tanks and planes. But the most basic form of security is the ability to feed your own people. And the American agricultural machine, the most productive on Earth, has a massive hidden dependency on Canada. The US Midwest is the world's breadbasket, but that breadbasket doesn't grow on its own. It requires massive amounts of fertilizer, specifically potash. Canada is the world's largest producer of potash, and the United States gets a staggering 81% of its potassium-based fertilizer imports from its northern neighbor. If the US were to cut off trade with Canada, the price of fertilizer wouldn't just go up, it would skyrocket. American farmers would be forced to look to Russia or Belarus, the only other major producers, at a time when those sources are geologically and politically inaccessible. A trade war with Canada is, quite literally, a war on the American dinner table. Without Canadian potash, American crop yields would crater, food prices would explode, and the breadbasket would become a dust bowl of economic failure. The vulnerability is not America's land. It's the chemical foundation that makes that land productive. And then there is the defense industrial base. Washington is currently obsessed with reshoring manufacturing to prepare for a potential conflict with a peer competitor like China. But you cannot build a 21st century military without critical minerals, and this is where the America First logic hits a brick wall. Of the 35 critical minerals identified by the US Department of Defense as essential for national security, Canada is a primary supplier of 13. This includes uranium for nuclear power and weapons, indium for high-tech displays, and aluminum for everything from fighter jets to armored vehicles. The US defense industry isn't just connected to Canada, it is built on top of it. The F-35 stealth fighter, the backbone of American air power, relies on a supply chain that crosses the Canadian border hundreds of times. If the US cuts off Canada, it isn't just losing a trade partner, it is detooling its own military. You cannot build Fortress America if you don't have the materials to build the walls, and those materials are currently sitting in the mines of Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan. But the food and the weapons are only the physical symptoms. To see the true self-harm of cutting off Canada, you have to look at the integrated nervous system of the economy. Most people think of trade as sending a product from A to B, but the US-Canada relationship is a shared production line. Take the auto industry. A single car part doesn't just go from Windsor to Detroit. It might cross the border 7 times as it is refined, stamped, assembled, and tested. This is a hyper-integrated ecosystem that has been optimized over 60 years. If the US imposes 100% tariffs or shuts the border, that production line doesn't just slow down, it shatters. For an American automaker in Michigan or Ohio, a border closure is an instant death sentence. They don't have the domestic capacity to replace the thousands of specialized components that come from Canada every day. By cutting off Canada, the US would be effectively shutting down its own factories, laying off hundreds of thousands of American workers, and handing the global auto market to China on a silver platter. The vulnerability is not Canada's factories, it's the fact that American factories cannot function without them. And then there is the energy paradox. We've heard a lot about American energy independence thanks to the shale revolution. But as we've discussed, the US refinery system is a specialized beast. It was built to process the heavy crude that comes from the Canadian oil sands. If the US cuts off Canadian oil, it doesn't matter how much light shale oil Texas produces. The refineries in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast cannot simply switch overnight. It would take years and billions of dollars in retrofitting to replace the 4 million barrels a day that come from Canada. In the meantime, gas prices in the US would hit record highs, and the industrial heartland would face an energy crisis that would make the 1970s look like a minor inconvenience. The vulnerability is not a lack of oil, it's a lack of the right oil at the right time. Finally, we have to talk about the logistical black hole. In early 2026, Canada made a quiet but devastating move. By shifting its grain and fertilizer exports away from US ports and toward its own expanded facilities in Vancouver and Prince Rupert, Canada began to decouple its logistical fate from the US. If the US continues to push Canada away, Canada will stop being the friendly neighbor that uses American ports and rails. It will become a logistical competitor. A Canada that trades directly with Asia and Europe, bypassing the US entirely, is a Canada that robs the US of hundreds of billions of dollars in transit fees and economic activity. The US thinks it is locking Canada out, but it might actually be locking itself out of the most efficient trade routes. So why does Washington still think it has all the cards? Because they are looking at gross numbers, not systemic dependencies. They see that Canada's GDP is smaller, so they assume Canada is weaker. They don't see the potash in the soil, the uranium in the grid, or the aluminum in the jets. The United States is a global superpower, but it is also a complex machine that has been designed to run on North American integration. You cannot remove the Canada part of that machine without the whole thing seizing up. The next time you hear a politician talk about winning a trade war with Canada, don't look at the tariff rates. Look at the price of bread, look at the assembly lines in the Midwest, look at the readiness of the US military. Because in the end, the biggest mistake the US can make is thinking that Canada is a foreign country. In economic and strategic terms, Canada is a vital organ, and as any doctor will tell you, you can't survive for long by declaring war on your own heart. The US and Canada are in a marriage where the assets are so mixed that a divorce doesn't just mean a split, it means liquidation. And in this liquidation, the US stands to lose far more than its ego. It stands to lose the very industrial and agricultural foundation that made it a superpower in the first place.